Hello, imperfect leaders. It's summer! And for leaders, that means reflection. And it means planning for the coming year. It is for that reason that this week's episode is an encore episode specifically picked with your upcoming year in mind. And then as Labor Day approaches, Season 3 will kick off. And I'm so excited about that because Jamie Almanzán from the Equity Collaborative is going to be joining me as a co-host and commentator. It is going to be great. So sit back and enjoy this encore presentation of An Imperfect Leader, the Superintendents and Leadership Podcast. At the end of every interview that we have for teacher candidates, we will say, "What questions do you have for us?" And they will always ask, "Well, what kind of support can I expect?" And we will always say, "Well, don't worry, we'll give you a mentor." But it's not real mentorship. I mean, it's support with the difficult kid or the field trip form or the grade card, but it isn't coaching. That's where partners like EdConnective step in. They provide observation and feedback with practice. That's real coaching. Their mission is to ensure that every student thrives by facilitating exceptional educator growth. So whether it's science of reading, whether it's leadership development, whether you're trying to build the best recruitment and retention efforts, check out edconnective.com. Hello and welcome to another episode of An Imperfect Leader, Leadership in After Action, a series where leaders look back at decisions they've made and consider a series of questions. I'm Peter Stiepelman, I'm your host, and I'm an imperfect leader. I spent more than 20 years teaching and leading, first in the Oakland Public Schools in Oakland, California, and then in the Midwest, Missouri to be exact, where I was a teacher and a principal, an assistant superintendent, and then the superintendent of the fourth largest district in the state. I'm constantly striving to learn from my experiences and from the experiences of other leaders. The aim of this podcast is to lift the learning and lift the imperfect leaders up. That way, when you hear the term imperfect, you'll see strength. Strength from the candor needed to recognize imperfection as a real advantage. Let's get started. My guest this week is so good. It had been suggested I talk to him because he's smart, he's compassionate, he's deeply reflective about his leadership practices, he's a principal, has been for 20 years. So where's the but in this sentence? You know how when people say like, "Oh, I love so-and-so so much," and I wouldn't say anything disparaging, but I promise you, there's no but here. However, I had resisted inviting my guest, Matt Hornbeck, because I knew it was going to challenge my fixed mindset on charter schools, and I wasn't ready to be challenged. So really, I'm the but in this whole thing because Matt helped me apply a growth mindset as I considered how charter schools can be great partners in the education landscape. Matt's charter school in Baltimore, Maryland is a neighborhood school. It enrolls the kids in the neighborhood. It adheres to Baltimore school rules and regulations. And it is so different from the for-profit predatory ones that we have witnessed in other parts of the nation. And we don't even talk about charter schools. We talk about relationships. And we talk about restorative practices, and he describes exactly what that process looks like, about fixing what has been broken. We talk about the early years of leadership and what was learned about focusing more on what you want as opposed to documenting what you don't want. Yeah, we don't talk about charters. And, so not but, I wanted to just say that he has me thinking more flexibly on the topic. Matt is terrific. Thanks for tuning in. Today on An Imperfect Leader, Matt Hornbeck is my guest. Matt is an established leader in Baltimore, Maryland. Before becoming a principal at Hampstead Hill, a Baltimore City charter school, he was an educational consultant with large urban districts on resource allocation and principal training, and he holds a master's degree in educational administration as well as a law degree. He's the son of a former superintendent. His father was Maryland State Superintendent and then later served as superintendent of the Philadelphia Public Schools. Matt, welcome to An Imperfect Leader.
So glad to be here.
As I learned more about you, I found a 2018 Baltimore Sun project called Roughly Speaking, where they asked principals, you being among the 5 that were interviewed, what it was like to run a Baltimore City school. And at that point, you were in your 15th year. In that conversation, you talked about a number of core components to successful schools, one being the benefits of incorporating restorative practices in your school. I wonder, for those who are listening who may not be familiar with restorative practice, can you talk a little bit about that? And then particularly on the spectrum of restorative practices, there's something called a restorative conference. And I'm kind of curious if you wouldn't mind describing one that you had been a part of.
Of course. Thank you, Pete. And thanks for this podcast and all you do to highlight such important issues to students, staff, and families, and to superintendents, because talking to practitioners is so important, and you are in it. And so I appreciate that. In terms of restorative practices, I'll start with saying that all schools and districts usually have the word joy in their mission statements. And joy is something hard to put your finger on and manufacture. And I think that our implementation over the last now 18 years of restorative practices, this is my 20th year here, is really a key component of why there's joy at our school. And we have about 900 students and 100 staff members. It is the difference between having people want to come to work, want to come to school, and not want to come to work and not want to come to school. When you implement restorative practices well, and adults and students feel seen and heard, which is the whole point of restorative practices, then attendance goes up and tardies go down. And I think achievement is directly linked to all of that as well. And we really have succeeded with that and have a very mature implementation of restorative practices. It's sort of like Charlie Brown's teacher, which, if you recall from way back when, didn't have a voice. Rah, 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 rah. Kids are always asked, why'd you do that? Why'd you do that? And it just sounds the same from every adult to every kid, whether they're 5 or 15 years old. And with restorative practices, we train staff to ask 3 questions. And well, first, let me start by saying on the continuum that you mentioned, Pete, first you start with doing a lot of community building circles. We do those at least 3 times a week, and we have circle logs that teachers turn in. We share questions between the 29 homerooms, and could be a simple question just like, what'd you do this weekend, or what are you going to do this weekend? Could be, what's your favorite color or candy bar, that kind of stuff. We model it in our faculty meetings, and we say, tell us a teacher you remember and why. And it builds community and creates those connections between people and kids. And then we're trained to ask 3 questions when there's conflict. And there's always going to be conflict. City Hall, central school, district headquarters, school, there's going to be conflict wherever. Whether it's mean girls in middle school, whether it's somebody knocking somebody's notebook out of their hand, something on recess, there's going to be conflict. And so that should be part of the expectation. And the way that restorative practices works and is so successful, we get the kids together, what happened? So both sides get to tell their story. She wouldn't let me come to her birthday party. He posted something on Insta, whatever it is that's the conflict. And the other side says, well, we used to be friends, and she won't let me sit with her at lunch. And adults have very similar conflicts. And then the second question is, who was affected? And building some empathy, right? Well, your mom's going to be affected because she's not going to like it when I call home and talk about the rough day you're having. The teacher's affected because they can't get through the lesson that they had planned. And you're affected because you're not in class. You're sitting here talking to me. And build some empathy, right? And they kind of go through that. And kids of all ages can kind of get that. And the third question is the magic. The third question is the one that really is the being seen and heard piece of this. What do you need to move on? And what you need to move on can be simply, I just wanted to say what happened, or I'd like my locker moved, or I'd like my cubby moved, or I'd like to sit somewhere else at lunch. So that is, if we do that over and over and over, and you build community with these circles, and then you have these restorative conferences where it can be serious matters as well. There could have been a fight. And let me be clear that restorative practices is not a substitute for the more traditional consequences. It is a supplement that dramatically reduces suspensions and office referrals and detentions and all those metrics that superintendents and principals are faced with, numbers, the demographic data behind those numbers and the stories behind those numbers. Restorative practice is very good at reducing those numbers. But if there's been a fight and somebody is coming back after a one-day suspension, and there's a restorative conference, and we have our detention set up for middle school students so that it's restorative. There's some coaching on, what happened, what could you do differently? There's a little protocol that the people who staff detention would go through. Same with the return from suspension. We may certainly have an administrator, and a parent, but we may have 2 or 3 students there together who had conflicts in the previous day or previous week. We may have teachers there. We have counselors. There have been times when we'll have school police officers with us. And again, that format is talk about what happened, who was affected, what do you need to move on. Sometimes there can be a contract written, letting the adults know that everyone is aware of everything that's happening and on the same page. You mentioned describing a particular conference. And one that comes to mind is last spring, there were 2 girls who had a lot of conflict, ongoing conflict, kind of cumulative conflict. Their friends were egging them on. This kind of what you can imagine from either movies or your own memories of middle school. So we worked with them for a while. We tried all the interventions and kind of conferences with each kid and decided to have a large restorative conference in the library. Both sets of parents came, both girls came. Our director of restorative practices came. I was there, an assistant principal was there. And we went through that protocol. Once the girls got to explain to each other in front of their teachers and administrators and parents what was happening, and you couldn't kind of hear the half-truths or misunderstanding that happens when you are talking to someone one-on-one, then it gets real quick. The girls came together and really felt good about the outcome. And for the rest of that school year and this school year, which is their 8th grade year, there have been no conflicts between those 2 students. That community that's built because of that process is an important part of our success. And a little to bury the lead, we just had, for the first time since the pandemic, test scores were released yesterday, and Hampstead Hills Middle School is the top performing school in our district in reading and math. Our elementary school is the 3rd highest in reading and 7th highest in math. And we are a neighborhood school that's not selective. And we have just an amazing teaching staff. So student performance, all of the consequence metrics like detention, suspension, and office referrals and attendance all move in the right direction, in my opinion, when a school leader or a district leader fully embraces restorative practices.
Thank you so much for that example. I will tell you that there are so many that I've talked to around the nation that are struggling, particularly post-pandemic, with discipline. And the traditional model of punishing and suspending only brings back the same kind of behaviors that were there beforehand. And so restorative practices really provides you a way to disrupt that cycle and really dig in and build meaningful relationships, because people don't hurt the people that they love. And particularly with school, I can use that word love because they really do care deeply for the people around them if they also feel valued and honored. And so I really appreciate the example.
Yeah, well said.
In the leadership model that I use to advise others, there's a dimension called leaders learning work. And that's really the mind of an organization's work. And inside that dimension is a term, supporting resilience. And so in learning more about you, I have really seen that resilience is an essential part of your work in your school and in the Baltimore City schools as a whole. I think about a program that you have championed called Leaders Go Places, where children contribute to the common good, they persevere, and a number of other components. What does resilience look like in your school?
So a lot of people in the education field, Pete, talk about grit, perseverance, resilience, these sort of education buzzwords that are popular today. And it's very challenging to say, well, you need more grit, or you need more perseverance, or you need to, just get her done kind of. And that doesn't really give the lay of the land to an adolescent or to a 6-year-old or 7-year-old that's struggling. And it it's hard work. And I think that as adults in the building, we have to show them and model what perseverance looks like and highlight it. And one of the things that we're big on, and this is just an example, but is writing, because it's such a synthesis of skills that you need for the rest of your life. And so writing takes a number of drafts, right? You don't just sit down and life is not a tweet. And so you definitely need to be able to communicate in writing, and having drafts and using technology like Google Classroom to be able to see in real time the editing process. I think that perseverance is a much broader discussion than just, go do this multi-layered task. Now we have those, like portfolio projects are another example of, and every student in our middle school participates in National History Day, which you talk about perseverance. That is really getting kids ready for high school and college. And it's not just the highest performing kids that participate in National History Day. Every student here does. And getting each other, being part of a team, relying on other people. All of those traits need to be modeled, and then someone will describe you as a person who can persevere after you achieve.
Matt, what does the term an imperfect leader mean to you? How does that resonate?
I think it's a genius move on your part to name a podcast An Imperfect Leader, because I think it's just a fact that leaders are not perfect. And when I think of an imperfect leader, I think it's somebody I think there's leaders that, unfortunately, you've got a range, right? Just like anything, there's a continuum. You got those people who are capricious and arbitrary. And I honestly believe people leave managers, not jobs. And so you're going to see high turnover. You're going to see dissatisfaction, low outcomes, or suppressed outcomes at whatever level they're working at. And then you're going to have the people who are a little bit more command and control, a little bit more like maybe they're insecure and it comes off in a leader as too forceful or too, my way or the highway. And I'm telling you to do this, and because of my title, I think you have to do it. And that is a very stressful situation for the leader and for the staff at district or school level. And then you've got what I think an imperfect leader implies, which is you can be a leader and be vulnerable. You can, in fact, be the most effective leader and be vulnerable. And that is, I think, the only way to be effective.
And we'll be right back. Hey, district leaders, I know you already know this. In schools worldwide, cell phones are posing real challenges on student engagement and mental well-being, and I want you to meet Yonder, a proud sponsor of An Imperfect Leader. And let me share this story from a visit I made to some schools in Silicon Valley. I asked some kids what they liked about Yonder, and after some funny looks, they shared that actually, with Yonder, teachers don't have to battle with them over phones anymore. In fact, one kid said to me he didn't have to worry anymore about his parents texting him in class, and the kid next to him sort of shoved him and goes, "Texting? My mom used to FaceTime me in class." I want to introduce you to a support system that increases teaching and learning. I want you to discover why 1 million students choose Yonder daily. Minimize distractions, maximize learning potential. To learn more, go to overyonder.com. YONDR. We're back for segment 2 of An Imperfect Leader, called Imperfect Leadership in After Action. My guest is Matt Hornbeck, principal of Hampstead Hill in Baltimore, Maryland. In this segment, we ask our guests to deconstruct a decision they had to make, and then we discuss it. So, Matt, what happened?
So one of the things when I thought about this podcast and thinking about a time when I made a decision that wasn't necessarily, in hindsight, the best decision, early on in my tenure, I was really struggling with staff attendance. And a school this size usually has about 550 days a year that we need coverage. And what I mean by that is there's 180 student days, but often there's 2 or 3 staff members out and we on a given day. And so there's 550 school days when we need to provide coverage. And since the pandemic, it's gone up to about 850 days. And that doesn't include coverage for IEP meetings or student support team meetings, or if someone needs to leave early because their own daycare has called and their own child is sick. but just hundreds and hundreds of days of coverage are needed. And it's very difficult in any district, in any school, as you well know, to provide coverage and to not split up classes and combine classes when you are short staffed. And that's just a disaster of a day and results in those teachers actually taking more mental health days shortly thereafter. One of the things that happened here was that in our district, you can only take a half day or whole day of leave. And so if a staff member said, if a teacher said, I need to leave at 1:00 for an appointment, would you like me to leave at 11:30 and take a half day? Or would you like me to just stay and work until 1 and then leave at 1? And then I'd basically have to mark them present for the whole day. And so I was getting clobbered on that because, just human nature. Nobody was doing anything necessarily malicious, but the appointments were being made in the afternoon hours, and people would just leave early. Well, what I decided to do and make an agreement with staff, and it's worked out very well for us, is keep track of late arrivals or early departures. And the way the district had it planned out wasn't working, and the way that I was trying to appeal to altruism was not working. And I was just trying to follow the rules, and it wasn't working for us. And so the way I tried to reflect and adjust to what was happening was to keep track of early departures and late arrivals, so that if a teacher needed 3.5 hours of, hey, I got to leave at 2:00 to go deal with the cable guy, or I've got to leave at 1:00 to go deal with somebody in my family sick and I have to get them to the doc, then we keep track of that. And if it doesn't add up to a half day, we don't take any time. But if it adds up to a half day, when it adds up to a half day, we take that. And all of a sudden, when it was up to the teacher to take their time and we were keeping track of it, then all of a sudden the appointments started to be made in the later afternoon after school. And that turned out to be a good thing for kids in learning. I think being creative and seeing the conditions on the ground is part of the challenge for district and school leaders, and feeling like you can come up with a solution that works and defend it if the district asks, and that sort of your reasonable teacher will get it is a key piece of my work. And that's just one example of how we do it here at Hampstead Hill.
So I'm curious about this because often a school will be told, look, we have procedures and this is how it works. And your teacher is out of the building, you haven't marked them out necessarily, and then something happens, and all of those types of, the greatest fears are what are presented to principals and why you can't do things. And it sounds like you have found a way to do that. What were you learning, or what did you learn about relationships when you made this shift from a very restrictive and absolute adherence to a rule and found a more flexible approach to honor the people in your building? What did you learn about relationships, or what new relationships were formed?
Yeah, it's interesting. I kind of was not mentioning it to supervisors and district staff for many years because it was working, and it was sort of a hush hush. And it's become such an effective tool for us over the last 12 or 15 years that I've told other principals about it and told district staff about it. And, I'm open with it about the union, and it works for us. I think that ultimately superintendents and principals and leaders in general are, I don't know about often, but frequently put in the position of having to make a decision and apologize later, and go ahead and do something that makes sense at the school level. So much of what we have to do at the school level is a construct, right? Because we're given the policies, we're given what the school board and the state board have decided is the best curriculum, the best policy, the best procedure. And then we have to make sense of it. And this just made sense as a way to have a win-win.
I'm thinking about the question I typically ask about what got overlooked. And it seems to me that from a system level, so not just at your building, but at a system level, what's getting overlooked is this absolute adherence to a procedure that's been put in place. And I use procedure different from policy because I think policies often leave things very generalized and then someone interprets it from the district level and creates a procedure. But you said from the very beginning, what it was doing was increasing the number of days of individuals being absent. And we certainly know post-pandemic, there are more people taking sick days because there's been a sort of stabilizing or sort of a review of, look, I'm not going to drag myself in there if I'm sick. It does anybody any good. And so I'm actually going to stay home if I'm sick. The piece that really spoke to me or resonated for me was the splitting up of classrooms. If you're in an urban or metropolitan district, and to some degree in rural districts, I'm sure, when you don't have a teacher and there is no substitute, you split up the classroom, and that fundamentally changes the day for everyone, for the children whose teacher is absent, as well as the teacher who now has welcomed 10 new students into their room. And so I'm wondering from this very long-winded question in terms of what got overlooked is that how might the original plan or procedure have sort of solved a problem, but didn't really think about the instructional needs of children and how your solution really built in a better pathway so that more predictably children could expect that their teachers would be there?
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head there, and it's somewhat of a rhetorical question because I think that one of the challenges that school leaders have is what you would call bleed time, and where minutes creep away. And if you've got, for example, as you know, if you have a chronically absent student and then you have a teacher who is absent a lot in a given year, they are not absent on the same days. And so if the kid's absent 3 weeks and the teacher's absent 3 weeks, that's actually 6 weeks, a month and a half without the teacher and the kid together in the room. And so it exacerbates the most the neediest students, the challenges that the neediest students face. And I think that that it is true that if you've got a procedure is not working at the ground level for practitioners, that having leaders who can make game day decisions or implement long-term practices like this one are a great example. And just to piggyback off of that, one of the things early on that happened was that the prior administrator who worked here for 11 years prior to me, was effective, but had a kind of traditional favorites, and no one was marked late in the morning. And so when I started, some of the teachers were walking in with the kids well past the contractual obligation to be here 15 minutes before kids. And so one of the things I did was start to mark people late at 5 minutes before kids got here. And some of the people really didn't like that. They thought I was not treating them as professionals. And I said, you can't arrive 5 minutes before the kids get here. You haven't taken your jacket off. And then the next year, in my third year, we did it at 1 minute past the time that they were contractually obligated to be here. Now, what that does, and I felt in hindsight, it seems trivial, but it was a very difficult thing to do with the entrenched way of doing things that had been in place. And what it does is gets not just the handful of people, because it's a very small group of people who are late every day. It has everyone who comes on time aware that I recognize that they're doing not just what they should do and what they can do, but what's good for kids. And then I'm handling the other challenges.
Yeah, you were focused on compliance. That is such a tale of all of us who have in our early leadership, is that we fall prey to compliance over having those conversations or as a community. How do we want to be with each other? What do we want for children? And how do we establish this cultural field that makes us all proud to be here, as opposed to you standing at the door monitoring the parking lot about when people arrive?
Yeah. And we even went so far as I would put a red dot, and boy, they didn't like the red dots. And so I'm sorry, it was a red L. And so they didn't like
oh
the
my
red
God,
L.
Scarlet L.
Scarlet
Great.
L. Oh, it was really intense. And so I said to them, to the handful of people, it's only 6 or 7 people out of 70 teaching staff. I said, well, what would you want? And they said, how about a green dot instead of a red L? So I'm like, done. Let's do the green dot. And then I don't worry about it, don't think about it, don't talk about it until the mid-year conference and the end of the year conference. And then if it's 2, 3, 4 times, whatever, man, parking was difficult. It's the same as being perfect. I don't make a big deal about perfect. And then if it's 15 or 20 or 30 days, then let's get that going in the other direction. But it's not something that I have to worry about every day. It's not dominating the conversation. You don't have to worry about me fussing at you on a given day. I changed my pattern from those early days to set something up in August that is tenable and enforceable and doable. That great things can happen. It's a synergy that happens when you have a relationship as opposed to a set of procedures or rules.
Matt, what advice might you give to a new leader?
Be patient, be in it for the long run, see and hear your staff, and try to connect with people and be consistent, and don't have favorites, and ask questions, and think of yourself as support, not as the center of attention. Think about what students and teachers need and the content they need to make the future brighter for all of us.
My guest again was Matt Hornbeck. And Matt, as you know, this podcast was designed for aspiring new and established leaders. And in the leadership model that I talked about earlier, there's a dimension called nested patterns, and that really speaks to the way that individuals behave. The hope is that these habits, become like a muscle, like muscle memory. One term in there is growth mindset. And I'd been somewhat of a fixed mindset on who gets to participate or who would participate on this podcast. And I'm so glad, as a principal, that you agreed to share your time and your treasure. And so thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Pete. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Music for An Imperfect Leader was written and arranged by Ian Varley. Sam Falbo created the Daruma doll butterfly artwork. Imperfect leadership is not a scarlet letter. It is a badge of honor. It recognizes that serving as a lead learner is about being a vulnerable leader, an empathetic leader, a compassionate leader. And I'm proud to be an imperfect leader, so I hope you'll join me next time for another episode of An Imperfect Leader, Leadership in After Action. Imperfect leaders. Are you facing challenges filling open speech-language pathologist positions within your district? It's kind of a silly question because I know you are. MPAT Speech understands the critical need for qualified professionals in your schools. They recognize that communication lies at the heart of academic success, and that's why they're dedicated to helping you bridge the gap by offering expert therapists and innovative telehealth solutions. Don't let open positions hinder your students' success. Partner with MPAT Speech today and ensure every child in your district has access to the speech therapy they deserve. MPAT Speech. EMPAT Speech.com. Empowering students, empowering schools.